I have not met a single organization on planet Earth that has patched all of their vulnerabilities that have been identified by their vulnerability scanner yet. But we still scan, we still find the vulnerabilities.
I think there's a lot of discussion right now about the prioritization problem.
It's a lot less about saying we're gonna fix every single issue that we find.
Hi, I'm Ben Carr, and welcome back to some industry conversations in security. Today, Tom Pace with NetRise.
I started my career in the Marine Corps doing not cybersecurity things. Went to Cylance where I handled a lot of ransomware cases, and then started NetRise in December of 2020. We focus entirely on the thing that's in front of customers. So the compiled code, the compiled Windows binaries, the compiled firmware images, the containers.
We've talked about ransomware as being we know it's criminal, but does it rise to the level of terrorism?
For a while, they were talking about making it illegal to make ransom payments. It's nonsensical. I handled multiple ransomware incidents. The CEOs of those organizations were absolutely beside themselves that they had to make these payments.
Hi, I'm Ben Carr, and welcome back to some industry conversations in security. Today, Tom Pace with NetRise. Hey, Tom, thanks for coming in and having a conversation with me.
Thanks for having me, man. Happy to be here.
So, Tom, maybe for those who aren't aware, don't know you, maybe give a little bit of background, introduction. You've got kind of an interesting and varied background in security here. Love to get everybody up to speed on it.
Sure, yeah. So, I started my career in the Marine Corps doing not cybersecurity things. I was in the infantry, did some intelligence work, ran around the Middle East for a good while. And then, came home from that, worked at PNC Bank doing security engineering and incident response. Then I worked for Department of Energy doing industrial control system security, which is kind of where I got a lot of the experience that laid the foundation for what we're doing at NetRise now. Left there, went to Cylance where I handled a lot of ransomware cases, did incident response, worked on a number of things, but also kind of built out a IoT firmware and embedded system practice, doing device assessments and teardowns and reverse engineering of those things. And then started NetRise in December of 2020, which seemed like the best time to start a company during peak COVID. Our initial focus was around providing visibility and risk identification into embedded operating systems for all kinds of devices, IoT, ICS, automotive, medical, telecommunications devices. And then since that beginning, we've really expanded into just all software supply chain security, but focusing on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of traditional software supply chain security, which operates using source code as its input, generally speaking. Sure. We focus entirely on the thing that's in front of customers, so the compiled code. So the compiled Windows binaries, the compiled firmware images, the containers. So we're really focusing on, ironically enough, a shift right mentality as it pertains to identifying vulnerabilities and risks in the assets in your organization on the compiled code side.
So that's interesting. Why that approach? Why do you think that's a better approach to kind of SBOM and supply chain than looking at it the other way?
Yeah, to me, it's objectively a better approach. And I understand that I'm the CEO of the company, but
so you have no bias,
none, stake in it. None. I operate purely in an objective manner. But here's why I say that, right? If you're generating an SBOM from source code and you're giving that to your customers, that is not representative of what you are giving to your customers. Your customers don't have your source code. So if you're, if you're Microsoft and you're saying, here's an SBOM from source code, a lot of those things that are in that SBOM aren't going to be in the compiled binary. Like things get ripped out, things get added, a lot of different things happen there. And so if you're focused on the source code side, which, by the way, I'm not saying don't do source code. We should keep doing that. But that is not the product that is being given to customers and is running in customer environments. In addition, you just have a much higher amount of issues that you identify in source code that end up not being issues once things have been compiled. And the opposite can also be true. You think you have an issue sorted out from a source code perspective, and then the compiler might remove that protection. Like a lot of times compilers will remove certain protections because it would break things. And
so how are you maintaining the visibility in the compiled side without losing perspective that you necessarily might have on the source code side?
Yeah. We're generating two different sets of data, right? So I'll give you an example. Oftentimes with source code, you don't have these problems of, there's no opportunity to be missing like debug symbols and the symbols related to functions and things like that. Those are just going to be there because you have the source code. But if you're looking at a compiled thing, you have the ability to also analyze hard-coded credentials, public keys, private key certificates that are baked into the code that are not going to be part of the source. So you have a number of other supply chain artifacts that only exist in the final product at the end of the day. And so for us, if I want to go provide value to, a large financial institution, I'm not able to analyze the source code of the things that they have bought from their third parties, right? Because that's not what they have to give me.
Sure.
They only have the binaries to give me. And it's actually very interesting, because I get this question a lot. It's really very similar to just a normal endpoint security company from a mental framework perspective. That is what endpoint security companies are doing, is compiled code analysis, because they realize that's what matters. That's what's running in enterprises, isn't source code. So you also have just this massive number of false positives and these number of issues that exist in source code. And so what we really advocate for in terms of bringing us into like a development pipeline and like a DevSecOps workflow is we'd rather find the problems or identify the problems initially from a compiled code perspective at the end, and then feed those problems back into the source code tools to fix them that way. When you identify all the problems in source code, you just have way more issues that you're going to identify. That's always going to be true. And then,
sure, but is the cost to fix easier on that side than it is fixing once it's been compiled and you have to go back?
Well, you're more sure that the problem exists.
It is, yeah, 100%.
So that's the trade-off, right? So if you're able to build quickly, that you would imagine that the overall time is reduced. And then also, if you're not doing that from a compiled code perspective at the end, you're gonna significantly reduce the number of issues your customers are gonna have. There's a vulnerability in our code that now you have to put out a patch, right? And so now that's time that you could have just totally eliminated initially, because you looked at the product at the end of the day before you pushed, instead of waiting for some researcher or some issue or whatever to find this issue in this code that got brought in from maybe some third-party dependency or library or component that you didn't see, because that thing happens after you're doing all of your source code analysis.
Yeah, so I can certainly see the value of that. I'm just wondering, do you get pushback from dev teams, right? Because as an operating CISO, like one of the challenges is always trying to fit in that work with the dev teams and kind of figure out how to mesh and get it to work right. And the pushback is always, they hate it when you come in after the fact, and it's, well, if you had told me earlier, if we had been able to fix this before we got here, you're adding unnecessary delay, time, it's extra work, right? So have you seen that pushback? Or, I can see the fact where when you come in and you look at it and say, okay, we found something that we wouldn't have found otherwise.
Yep.
Certainly a benefit and advantage. But I'm just wondering how that works with dev team pushback.
That's absolutely some of the pushback and feedback we get. So what we really advocate for is not, if you want to use the output of our platform to break builds and prevent things from getting into production, like that's up to you. What we really are advocating for, especially at this stage, is really more, we want to give you this visibility so that you can make data-driven decisions on this data. And if you want to do that now and break a build, that's just your decision. Okay. We have plenty of customers who are not doing that. And they use this to say, okay, guys, we are consistently finding these 4 or 5 same issues at the end of the day. Let's take that and feed that back in through next quarter or for the next.
Yeah, to look at more systemic problems and figuring out where that's actually making it into production versus trying to stop.
Exactly. It just really depends, right? We have some companies who, no matter how many big issues they find, they're pushing that thing into production, right?
Yeah.
Because they have engineering commitments and things like that. but now they have data to like make decisions in the future much, much better, right? Now that's just for the development teams. Our biggest market opportunity and the people we really care about working with and selling to are developers are a thing. We're going to do that. We care about the end user who's just consuming these binaries, the software consumers, which is every company on the planet, right? So any device they buy, any software they're licensing, any operating system they're using in their environment, those are the things that we're really excited about, because we're giving people a totally new perspective and viewpoint into the vulnerabilities and risks that exist in their thing that they didn't know were there. So as an example, if you have if you're using a vulnerability scanner, it's going to say, hey, you have Adobe Reader 11 installed, and Adobe Reader 12 is the newest version. So the number of the vulnerabilities that exist are the difference between 11 and 12.
Oh, sure.
Makes perfect sense. What we say is, give us Adobe Reader 11. We are going to decompose that entire executable for you, give you all the libraries, all the third-party components, all the supply chain artifacts related to that thing, and give you a much more realistic representation of the risk. We're not just going to say, here are all of the CVEs that Adobe feels like telling you about. It's not even debatable. It's very well known that all of these software producers have CVEs that they know exist and that they're not telling people about.
So do you bring that information into, I think about like a CVE repository, right? And then kind of that equates to that. So, if I'm using a vulnerability tool, they've got that list. They're scanning, they're looking, they're making that identification, but they already know what's vulnerable for that version, right?
Exactly.
Are you doing it in the same way, or are you scanning those binaries every time for that customer for their specific environment?
We really need to, we don't operate under the premise of a scan.
Yeah.
Because essentially, once we get a binary, we're ripping it apart and giving you all the pieces and parts. Like, here are the ingredients.
But you don't have to do that again for
correct.
Yeah, right.
Correct.
Yeah.
You do it one time.
Yeah.
Which is another great thing. Yeah. The concept of scans in like the vulnerability management space, in my opinion, is going to disappear relatively soon. Because if you just have the binary, why are you repeatedly scanning it? If you have it, just break it apart. Here are all the pieces and parts. And then what you do is you update the enrichment of those things. So if you find OpenSSL version 1.1.1 is in Adobe Reader.exe, you know that that's there. If new CVEs come out for OpenSSL 1.1.1, you don't need to like rescan. You just, that enrichment gets updated. So it's a different like paradigm in terms of how you're thinking about evaluating the risk of these things. And at the same time, it builds you a comprehensive software inventory from the ground up versus saying, here are all the applications installed on your operating system, which is not a software inventory. It's a very high level application inventory, which does not include all the other code that makes up all of those things that exist.
So do you apply you mentioned background in IoT and IT, right? So in IoT and OT, how do you see that? Like, do you do the same thing?
Same thing.
In space as well?
Yeah, and that's where we started off. Was we developed, a platform that was capable of reverse engineering firmware and embedded operating systems at scale. So if you take a Cisco switch firmware image, 100% like compiled, like we're not getting anything from anybody. It's just the same image that everyone else gets, and you got to upload that into our platform. We would extract the file system out of that compiled binary, and then recursively extract all of the other nested file directories that are in there, generate an SBOM for all those components, identify all of the other supply chain artifacts, and just do the exact same thing we would do on a single Windows application that we can do now. And the visibility you end up giving people is something they have not seen before. So, if you look at these organizations if you look at, IoT and ICS and medical devices and automotive and all these things, they're just building things on top of a system that really got built
20 years ago.
Exactly. But here's the crazy thing about the way you just said that. Everyone knows that's true.
Yeah, but nobody wants to do anything about it.
It's really kind of wild.
Yeah.
Everyone knows it's true.
It's not even quietly spoken about.
No.
It's like we admit that. Like, we're not going to change it, right?
And that's what's so wild to me when I demo to someone like, hey, here's a brand new industrial control system. Here's a brand new wireless access point. Here's a brand new security camera. Brand new, fully patched, latest firmware version. And then we find an open source component from 15 years ago running. And everyone's like, well, yeah. And I'm like, what do you mean? Well, yeah. Imagine if I gave you a brand new Windows 11 operating system and we applied every single patch to it. And you ran a vulnerability scan and there is a vulnerability from a component from 15 years ago. The world would go insane. That is totally unacceptable in one set of our environment. But another set of the environment, they're just like, well, yeah.
Yeah, but the honest about that is that they're typically the most critical systems.
Of course.
Right? It's a weird dichotomy, which I've never been able to wrap my head around. It's like, well, yeah, the desktop that the secretary uses, we could patch that. But
I use that analogy all the time.
Controller that's actually running the furnace, right, that's making molten hot material in the production facility, that we can't touch.
I've gone over this exact narrative. People ask me, like, well, how is this the case? Here's my answer. Here's one of my answers. I think there's a few. The biggest answer, in my opinion, is that we haven't had a way to give that visibility at scale in an automated fashion, right? Before EDR, did anybody really think that all the processes that were running in our environment and all of the activity that was going on those endpoints was perfectly legitimate and none of it was malicious or anomalous or going to cause problems? No one thought that. We didn't have a way to collect all of that information at scale to get that kind of visibility, and now we do, right?
Sure, but in the IoT and OT side, it's a little bit different though, right? Because the fight necessarily isn't against, so I think, look, CISO side of the house, right? You're working with enterprise IT and you say, hey, we have this issue. And you can have the debate about, does it need to get fixed or doesn't it need to get fixed, right?
Yep.
But there's an eventual goal of, hey, we're going to have to remediate this or we're going to have to accept the risk.
Correct.
The challenge here is that I see, and correct me if you have a different thought model on this, is you get in this environment where it's an OT system or it's a CAD scanner, and you say, okay, we found this problem. Let's say we look at it in the best way possible. We've looked at the binaries, we evaluate. Hey, here's what we need to fix. The pushback is, like, we can't fix it. Why can't you fix it? Well, because it's not supported by the manufacturer, right? These manufacturers, like, and God love them, they just won't, they won't take that proactive stance of they're not going to do anything, right? And I track it back to cost. That's my hypothesis, right? It's just, we built it, we're getting a revenue stream off of this thing that's sunk costs we had 20 years ago, and we don't want to open it up again, right?
Totally agree. So we get this all the time. So couple things from a if we want to talk specifically about like OGICS and these like more critical things, cost is a part of it. It's really even more so about they have spent an extraordinary amount of time doing all of this like safety critical testing, and you just can't arbitrarily
R&D and the validation and the certifications.
When you're trying to update, let's just use ICS and OT devices because it's kind of the most egregious example, right? I mean, we had some systems when I was at DOE where we had literally an 8-hour patch window a year. Yeah. So it didn't even matter if you found the craziest thing on planet Earth. Like, available, these things had to stay online because they were doing something that was so important. So that's one element. The other element would be it's a lot less about saying we're going to fix every single issue that we find, right? I don't know if I got to think of the right logic word. It's not a red herring, but it's like that comment only really resonates if we're already applying that same logic to our environment now, which we're not. I've not met a single organization on planet Earth that has patched all of their vulnerabilities that have been identified by their vulnerability scanner yet, right? But we still scan. We still find the vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion right now about the prioritization problem, right? So I'm a big believer in that you have to do some type of prioritization, right? You have to figure out how to burn down, I call it the vulnerability mountain. You have to figure out how to burn down the mountain, right?
Totally agree.
Over time. But I think the goal should be, we want to remove everything, realizing there's an amount of risk. And just because we have a very low level of vulnerability doesn't mean we never want to get to it. It should remain on that list. But there could be a lot of critical or very high level things that come out over time that are going to keep pushing that down the list.
And this is where we really try and stay away from, for this exact reason, the vulnerability discussion in terms of what we do. Because you just get mired in this conversation where it's like, well, you guys are finding all these CVEs and like blah, blah, blah. And we're like, God, that's not what we're solving for, actually. What we're solving for is saying, here is a list. Here are all the things that make up all the things in your environment.
Sure.
That's the problem we're solving for, right?
Yeah.
Now, what's the next thing people want to talk about? Okay, well, what vulnerabilities exist in all those things, right? But that use case, it's not that it's not important. It's very important, obviously. We're much more interested in saying things like, all right, so let's imagine we find a 15-year-old open source component in a thing, and there's no CVEs for it. There's none. That is still insane, because if it's open source, by definition, anyone on the planet has had access to that source code for 15 years. Do we really want to operate under the assumption that that code has not been compromised just because somebody has not released a CVE for it?
So there's a philosophical discussion in here, right? At the very high level. So I think I agree in practice with what you're saying, right? So, but at the same time, look, there could be code that's written 15 years ago, or there could be code that's written 30 years ago that's got no vulnerabilities. Like, there just could be. It's potentially possible, right?
Sure.
In that case, it's fine, right? And if no one's aware of the vulnerability, if it doesn't exist, the problem is the zero-day vulnerability, right? Zero-day vulnerability doesn't mean that it just started today. It could be 15-year-old code with a zero-day vulnerability because, it's aware.
Well, right? we know that that's happening, right? I mean, look at the WannaCry ransomware attack, right? That was a vulnerability that we know for a fact the NSA had been exploiting for a decade. That just existed, that nobody had found.
Yeah, but I think device manufacturers are going to say, like, if there's nothing that's wrong with the code, just because it's necessarily old doesn't need to be real. Look,
agreed. But
I enjoy a 68 Camaro, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with a 68 Camaro. Could it be done better? Probably yes, right? But there's value in the 68 Camaro as a 68 Camaro. Now, if the engine develops, say, a cracked block, I got to fix it.
So I agree with you. I'm not advocating for, because we're using old code, we should update it arbitrarily. Yeah. What I'm saying is, you should have visibility into that.
Visibility too.
So you can make whatever decisions you want to make. Yeah. We're not even giving people the ability to make the decision. That's the problem.
So we agree to agree on this, right? That's a great point.
And it's an EDR thing, right? Like, the way I characterize what we are doing, from an analogous security product perspective, as the first 5 to 7 years of EDR. People forget that a company like CrowdStrike had zero preventative capabilities for the first 6.5 years of the company. All they were was a visibility play. That's all they did. That's all Carbon Black did.
There's value in, right?
It's worked out okay for CrowdStrike, I think. Right? And so that's what we are doing, is saying, guys, here's a new set of data.
So I would equate what you're doing, and feel free to disagree with this, right? But I would equate what you're doing with essentially asset management, right? Like,
it's a different type of asset management.
So that's inherently the problem, is people have thought about asset management as a physical asset that they're trying to manage, and it generated initially, again, from a financial side, right? Trying to figure out what assets I had, what's the cost over a long term, how do I financially account for that? What it moved into was an IT problem that was never really accounted for fully. And people said, well, we can't fix it, so we're just going to live with what we have and get an 80%, right? And that's good enough.
Yep.
But security guys came in and said, that's not good enough. I need to know the entire asset inventory that I have so I can actually protect and defend against it, right? And so I can know when I have an issue that I have to go address. And I think this is where, we've extended assets from physical assets to temporal assets to APIs to identity. And I think this is the same thing. It's like, what's your software inventory asset, and what are the components that you're using that create that full inventory you're looking for?
That's right. And so one of the other, I guess, analogies we've used here is, existing asset inventory solutions are essentially, the way to think about them would be like a network intrusion detection system.
Yeah.
We are solving the asset inventory problem from the host intrusion detection system perspective. So I've used that analogy a bunch of times, right? If you have a network intrusion detection system, you just not install endpoint security. And no one says, we just don't even bother. No one says that. And so that's exactly the kind of narrative. And if you think about the prioritization of security controls and environments, everybody knows critical security control number one, asset inventory. Nobody can name critical security control number two, and these are in priority order. It's software inventory. Malware defense is number 8. It's number 8. But everybody has an antivirus, and no one can produce a true software inventory. No one.
And I think this would, the move towards SBOM was trying to get at, but it's not really complete, right? It's
because a bunch of vendors have ruined it, that are incompetent and incapable of doing even the basics around SBOM. I mean, the number of objections I have to deal with that are so idiotic around, well, there's no standard, there's no this, there's no that. There's like 5 standards. NIST has been talking about this for 15 years. Yeah. You have multiple frameworks that are industry accepted, one from OWASP and one from the Linux Foundation. Like, all of this is just craziness. And frankly, you have a lot of very large technology companies spending a lot of money in Washington, D.C. to try and prevent these things from happening, right? And you know what that means? That means you're doing the right thing. That if giant technology companies are spending millions of dollars to pressure Congress and the federal government to not make SBOMs a requirement, do you think they're doing that because all their software is good, or do you think they're doing that because they know where the bodies are buried and they know that sunlight's the best disinfectant?
Oh yeah, well, you get back, it's equivalent to the legacy, the CAT scan machines and the IoT side of the house, which they're going to realize that there's an inherent legacy problem which just isn't really being holistically addressed.
100%.
All right, so if we can pivot a bit, because I think what we've been talking about is really interesting. It touches on kind of an adjacent topic, right, which is one that's of interest to us, right? I think about the IoT OT problem, really related to this legacy issue, right? So these CAT scan machines, the industrial control systems that have this legacy issue, I think about it in the same way that I think ransomware is really affecting. It's a critical infrastructure problem. It's something we're not really addressing well holistically, right? Certainly as a country, but I think globally. We've talked about ransomware as being we know it's criminal, but does it rise to the level of terrorism? Does it rise to the level of warfare? This problem on the IoT OT side is kind of the same thing. It's a massive critical infrastructure risk problem, right? It's a systemic risk that we're not really addressing really well. So how do you see that? Like, does there need to be a different approach? Do we need to force that this stuff gets addressed? I mean, these systemic risks, ransomware, legacy not being addressed by the vendors and just kind of leaving it alone, and we've got just embedded risk.
So a couple comments. First, whenever people talk about critical infrastructure, they almost always mean OT, ICS, manufacturing, utility, things like that.
Yeah, but I mean in the broader sense, right? So when we saw Change Healthcare is a critical system risk, right?
That's exactly the point. That's the point I wanted to make. If you look at the critical infrastructure sectors, from DHS, every company is part of critical infrastructure, just about. So that's an important, I think, like financial services, critical infrastructure, telecommunication carriers, critical infrastructure.
So I would just alter maybe what I was coming from. What I meant was, if you look at it as an up-leveled risk, if you say, okay, well, we know that if you're operating an oil refinery, it's a critical infrastructure risk, right? Yep. But having a problem in one PLC in that environment doesn't really mean that it's critical infrastructure, right? If we have a systemic risk that affects that whole refinery and takes it down, that now becomes a critical infrastructure risk. So it's more of the critical systemic risk versus just, we call it critical risk because it makes sense.
I totally agree with that framework. So in terms of how we're thinking about like ransomware, attempting to solve that problem, I was just involved in so many of these conversations. I was actively engaged with, the Secret Service and the FBI when I was at Silence, doing a lot of these negotiations and getting them Bitcoin addresses and things like that so that they could help track people down, even though, Bitcoin's totally anonymous. Sure. Whatever helps you sleep at night. And so I think what is maybe a better way I've tried to think about it is, what are the solutions? The DOJ, I don't know where this legislation and all this is at this point, but, for a while they were talking about making it illegal to make ransom payments.
Yeah, that's kind of been, judicially has kind of pushed back and said it's unlikely it's
nonsensical. It's absolutely nonsensical. It's never going to work ever. It's just not going to happen. So all you're going to do is,
we can have a whole separate discussion on that. That's
sure.
Yeah.
I handled multiple ransomware incidents, and the CEOs of those organizations were absolutely beside themselves.
Yeah.
That they had to make these payments. And I said, yeah, you guys have two options, right? You can make this payment, or you can just not have a company anymore. So you choose. So we have as an American society, we can say we're going to ship, like, if we think we're going to stem the global tide of ransomware because some organization with 500 people doesn't make a $200,000 ransomware payment, we can say that and make us feel good on the inside, but it doesn't matter. They're going to keep doing what they're doing. And now we're going to put a company out of business, and all those people aren't going to have jobs, and no one's better for it.
But if as a society, as a nation, as a global premise, right? If we said that we're going to make the payment illegal, it can't be made, right?
We make drugs illegal. We make guns illegal. We make a lot of things illegal, and people do them.
Sure, but at a micro level, that's easy to create that transaction, right? But if I don't want to name a company, but pick a company, right? So the Fortune 50 company that made a $75 million ransomware payment, right? If that was illegal and that could have happened, right?
Is that the one who controls GPS?
I'm not sure.
But like, there was a company like that, that we all, that if they didn't make that payment, then just those things are degraded anyway.
But I guess my point is, yes, initially you'll have some initial impact, right? But the monetary incentive will go away very quickly, right? This is a criminal enterprise, and they're doing it because it's low barrier to entry, it's low cost, it's something to do. There's a lot of revenue that comes in. If you and I could start up a business model that made $75 million overnight, and we had no potential downside to it, and we could do it without any infrastructure, yeah, hell, let's go do it tomorrow.
Agreed.
But the issue is, it's really easy for these guys. There's not been a lot of blowback. There's not been a lot of, we've seen a couple takedowns have happened, but we haven't had a really good response to this. And so my premise is, and we've talked about this on some other podcasts,
mm-hmm.
if we made it illegal and we took away the monetary impact and we backstop that with, let's say, the U.S. government kind of helping companies out in the midterm, there need to be some policy.
That's that, right? I think here's what's really frustrating to me about the idea of making ransomware payments illegal. You're putting the onus and responsibility on the people that are least capable of doing something about it, and that are going to be also consequently impacted the most, which is like not a great set of incentives from the federal government side.
Sure.
Like, hey, we're the government, we're here to help. How are you going to help me? This is illegal. Who's going to bear the brunt of those consequences? You. So what do I get out of this exactly?
Yeah, I'm postulating that there's a holistic policy decision that could be made, right? Not just you can't make payments. Like, if you did that, yeah, you're right. It's a complete failure, right? It doesn't help anyone out. No. There has to be a plan for how you bridge that gap between we don't make payments and the removal of the monetization motivation actually takes effect, and we stop seeing the prevalence of
it. We know for a fact, I know for a fact, that the federal government is tied into these organizations. Like, they know who's doing this.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a secret. We think the NSA and the FBI doesn't know who's conducting worldwide ransomware operations. Of course we do, because we kill them when we decide to. We kill them when we decide to, all the time. Whenever we need a good press release and we're mad at Iran, that's when we're going to go kill Sam. Not like we didn't know who was doing it the prior 5 years. Of course we did. But it wasn't politically attractive enough for us to go kill that. So the very people who have the ability to kill these things and to stop these things from happening are the very ones not doing it. And they want to push it off on all the other people who are at least capable of stopping it.
Yeah, that's the challenge has been for business, for, commercial entities. It's been really hard because there's been this, like, look, we know what's going on, but you're responsible for handling it, but we're going to tie your hands behind your back and not let you actually do anything in response to actually really defend against it, right?
To me, you let the market solve the problem. That is exactly what Halcyon's doing, right? To me, like, that's the cool narrative for you guys, is that if you let the market address this problem, the market will. If it becomes so painful for everybody, and it's such a nightmare and such a giant problem, then someone is going to create a solution that fills that gap. And that is exactly what is happening. So, I mean, by going and saying, like, we want to kill ransomware, I mean, oddly enough, you're kind of killing your entire pipeline of business, which doesn't seem to be a very productive narrative for you guys to be talking about.
Look, I think, talking about the bigger problem is always good, right? Yes, look, if ransomware was solved, it wouldn't be great for us as a business, right? So that's certainly true. But, I'm looking at the more altruistic side of, like, how you actually get to solving. Let me give you a great example of the problem. I think there's a great, in the vacuum of that, you have to have a solution like Halcyon.
Here's a great example. Denial of service attacks don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
They don't exist anymore. Why? Because they brought down the entire American financial services industry in the fall of 2012. And then the financial services industry went to the federal government and said, this isn't happening anymore, guys. And then they subsidized AT&T and Verizon and Akamai and Cloudflare and all these other companies to build solutions. And they were like, if you're going to allow, like, our banks to just be taken offline by some idiots overseas, like, that is totally unacceptable. So the market reacted, they created solutions. Denial of service attacks don't happen anymore. There you go. But to make things illegal and have that's just not the way I think it's going to work. I think the way it's happening now is going to create a solution and a positive outcome. And it's going to take time. And then we're going to just have the same discussion here 5 years from now about the next, whatever ransomware becomes, because Halcyon has, done such an incredible job that it's just, like, less of a problem, right? And you see this already. Like, you look at how successful companies like CrowdStrike and SentinelOne are from an EDR perspective. So you see attackers pivoting and targeting things that don't have EDR, finding 0 days in Palo Alto, popping VPNs, going after telecommunications equipment connected directly to the internet that doesn't have EDR installed. So it's just this constant game theory.
Yeah, that's why security isn't a static industry, right? That's why it continuously moves on, and that's why we have jobs, right?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be unemployed anytime soon.
Tom, that's a great place to end it. I really thank you for coming on and having a discussion with me. It was really engaging, and great thought. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
All right.